Nearly 1 year ago, last October, 17 American sailors were killed when the USS Cole was bombed off of Yemen. 12 Americans were among the 224 people killed when terrorists bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. 19 Americans were killed in the attack on the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia in 1996. On April 19, 1995, a bomb killed 168 people and injured more than 500 when the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City was attacked. In February 1993, 6 people were killed and 1,000 injured when a bomb exploded 2 stories beneath the World Trade Center. Kathleen?
From Waco to Oklahoma City, former Deputy Attorney General Eric Holder is no stranger to dealing with deadly terrorist attacks. And Mr. Holder joins our Del Walters now in the studio to talk more about today's tragic events. Del?
Mr. Holder, we are now receiving reports from CNN that Kabul, Afghanistan may be being bombed, which would mean that there's some sort of U.S. retaliation underway. It has long been a belief that this nation will not assassinate a foreign leader or a target. Is there a different set of circumstances that come into play as a result of today's terrorist attacks?
Federal law prohibits the assassination of individuals or leaders of countries, but federal law does permit us to go after people for defensive purposes. And a person like bin Laden, given what has happened today and what he has done to this country in the past, I think certainly would fall outside that prohibition of assassination.
So if President Bush gives the order, Osama bin Laden can be assassinated legally within the parameters of United States law.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the term assassination, but I would say that if the determination is made that bin Laden is behind this attack, and we certainly know that he was behind other attacks, there would be a basis to go after him specifically within American law.
There are going to be people that are going to wonder, how could this happen in this country? During your watch, which just ended, was there any indication that an attack of this magnitude could be pulled off or was even in the works?
Now, even for bin Laden, this sounds like something that is pretty extraordinary. I mean, he's probably the most closely monitored terrorist in the world. We have all kinds of intelligence capabilities, and we would certainly see things about him through the course of time. But something along these lines, something this coordinated, something this extensive, is fairly extraordinary.
You told me that this is not the first time that there has been a terrorist attack planned using airliners. Brief our audience on what that was.
Yeah, in the early 90s in the Philippines, there was an attempt, a plan was made to bring down, I think, about 11 747s. That plan was foiled, however, and the person who was responsible for it, or at least for the planning of that attack, was actually tried and convicted in New York City.
There were fears in this country around the time of Y2K that we were going to see something like this then. Were there serious concerns among the FBI and Justice Department officials that airport security just was not what it should have been?
That's always been a concern. Terrorists always, one of the favorite targets of terrorists are airplanes and airports, and that's a place that we always try to give special attention. But there's always been concern that there has not been adequate security around airports, and that's certainly one of the questions we're going to have to ask once we get through this. How did these people get on these planes, I presume with some kind of weapons, or at least with an ability to overcome pilots and get into the cockpit?
And briefly, before I toss back to Maureen and Kathleen, this is a personal note for you. You grew up in New York City. The school that is now being used as a triage center for the World Trade Centers was your school.
Yeah, I went to high school there. Stuyvesant High School is right next to the World Trade Center. It's now being used as a place, a triage center for people injured in the blast. And so for me, it's something that's very personal. I saw the World Trade Center's towers constructed when I was about the age of 20 in New York City. So this, for me, has been a pretty horrific day.
Eric Holder, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kathleen and Maureen, back to you.
Del, thanks very much.
We want to point out to you that at the top of your TV screen, you're going to see closings that could affect your schedule tonight or tomorrow.
As for closings, the U.S. Capitol Police hope that Capitol Hill can get back to business as usual, they say, as soon as possible. But no word yet on whether they will return to work tomorrow. All Capitol Hill buildings were evacuated early today, and members of the congressional leadership were taken to a secure location where they could coordinate with their members and keep in contact with the president. Despite some reports, no incidents have occurred on or around the Capitol Hill grounds today, but extra security measures will remain in place for the foreseeable future.
Because of today's incidents, thousands of local and federal government and private industry workers were sent home from their jobs this morning. ABC 7 News reporter John Harder saw the gridlock develop as thousands tried to leave the city. John is live on the Mall tonight. John?
Maureen, at this hour, there's hardly anybody on the streets but guards, as you see. in downtown Washington. But as you said this morning, a different picture. Fear and panic gripped much of the Washington area because no one was certain if there were going to be more tragic attacks yet to come. This morning, emergency vehicles tried to get through a major traffic jam as workers fled the city.
And we were sitting there, and all of a sudden we heard about the bombing at the Pentagon. So the president said it's best to leave.
Got into work, and everyone was looking out their windows. You could see the smoke coming from the Pentagon, and then someone said there was a fire on the mall, and so we went out and looked at that. You could see the smoke everywhere. So I decided to go home.
Folks, let the bus go through, please.
When traffic became paralyzed at Connecticut and K, this citizen pitched in, effectively directed it.
That way, please. Thank you. We're just working it out, trying to get the traffic going.
Hey, do you have any experience doing this?
No. Thank you.
Workers also left jobs in the suburbs. Here they're streaming out of the Census Bureau in Suitland. Many downtown had fear in their eyes as they rushed to get home. Getting an open cell phone or landline was tough because of jammed circuits. Metro stations filled quickly. Station signs urged people to call a taxi or a relative if they needed a ride. All Metro rail stops but the Pentagon station were open. By mid-morning, many retail businesses in the downtown area closed their doors.
Just to let you know, this is not going to reopen anytime soon. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but it's for your own safety.
Streets around the White House, State Department, and several other government buildings were closed off, and by early afternoon, most people had left the downtown area. Many streets were empty. Tourists Ruth and George Canvas are on a week-long visit to Washington from Las Vegas.
Our pleasure has been diminished by the events that have happened in our country today.
So what are you going to do with the rest of your visit to Washington?
Well, good question. We hope that the city will reopen tomorrow.
Traffic was gridlocked until early afternoon. Later this afternoon, we talked to former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, leaving his office. He called for retaliation and said he was going to give blood at the Washington Hospital Center.
Give blood because on TV they say there's a blood shortage in both New York City and Washington, D.C. today.
Your reaction to this?
It's very sad for the world. We, the U.S., are going to have to determine who was responsible and then retaliate. Former Defense Secretary McNamara worked most of the day in his office on 17th Street before leaving to give blood. No word yet on whether or not federal workers will have a full day of work tomorrow. That decision should be made in the next couple of hours. It's been a frightening and frustrating day for Washingtonians, but we should all be impressed with the public safety, the fire, police workers, and the impressive job they did today. Maureen?
And we are very impressed with that. Thank you so much, John.
Well, the attacks really disrupted most every aspect of our lives here, from schools to transportation to sporting events that had been scheduled. ABC 7 News reporter Greta Cruz is in our newsroom right now to run down what continues to be closed. Greta?
Kathleen, it is a long list, so bear with me. We have been informed, John started to talk about it, all federal agencies will be open for business tomorrow. Unscheduled leave policy is in effect. Now let's get to the schools right now. Some of them closed early today, but most at this point are planning to be open tomorrow. D.C. public schools are reassessing at this point. But a long list of colleges and universities have canceled their classes tonight. American University, Bowie State, Catholic University, College of Southern Maryland, Columbia Union College, Georgetown University, George Mason University, George Washington University and Law Center, Howard University, Johns Hopkins University, which includes the Baltimore and Washington area campuses, Marymount University, Montgomery College, National Louis University, University of Phoenix, Maryland, Potomac College, Southern Maryland Higher Education Center, Southeastern University, Stratford College, and Trinity College, also UDC and University of Maryland University campus. Now, many local school districts and governments have also canceled evening activities, but at this point, the only schools that have notified us they will, in fact, be closed tomorrow are Anne Arundel County Public Schools, closed tomorrow. In Northwest D.C., St. Albans, NCS, and Beauvoir, all closed tomorrow. Potomac School in McLean and St. Stephen's and St. Agnes in Alexandria, also Calverton School in Maryland. Now on to the rail transportation. Metro is open, but the Pentagon and National Airport stations are closed. They will reevaluate everything tonight. Amtrak running again now with hourly service out of Union Station to New York and on to Boston. VRE has limited service on the Fredericksburg line. They were supposed to run the final train out of Union Station tonight at 6. And on the Manassas line, a final shuttle train will be leaving Alexandria at 7 tonight. Now tomorrow, only trains with an S next to the train number will be running. MARC trains are once again running on the Penn, Camden, and Brunswick lines, but the Brunswick trains are running only to the Brunswick station, with buses making the rest of the stops to Martinsburg. Tomorrow, MARC will be on holiday service. Now, a few other announcements. All the monuments in Washington remain closed until further notice. For Meade, except for emergency personnel. Only emergency personnel are to report to work tomorrow. And you may have not gotten mail today. Delivery was suspended in downtown and northwest Washington and New York City. The post offices in the district will remain closed until the state of emergency here in the city is lifted. The Postal Service tells us Virginia and Maryland mail delivery is not affected. All U.S. Red Cross workers are asked to please report to work tomorrow. Kennedy Center has canceled evening performances. All Major League Baseball games canceled tonight, including the O's. And D.C. United soccer game tomorrow night is canceled. Some malls were even closed today. Pentagon City, Tysons, Montgomery Mall. Both a mix of mourning and security concerns. It's definitely not business as usual tonight or tomorrow. Back to you.
Really brings home the magnitude of today's events. Thanks very much,
A lot of people
Greta.
extremely upset by these incidents. That's it for our special edition of ABC 7 News at 6 o'clock.
ABC 7 News will have continuous coverage of this American tragedy throughout the evening, as well as President Bush's address at 9 o'clock. We send you back now to ABC News in progress as we take a look at the flags flying at half-staff here at the Washington Monument.
This is not like the black boxes necessarily, which keep automatic records of the plane's systems. The cockpit tape is more vulnerable.
The cockpit, the in-flight recorder will be invaluable here. I think the best shot, obviously, is the one that went down in Pennsylvania, because they can search for that within the wreckage of an airplane. It is an uphill struggle to find a cockpit voice recorder in the wreckage of the two twin towers on top of the wreckage of an airplane. So perhaps some of the earliest clear answers may come from the plane that crashed in a field.
People will remember around the country the painstaking effort to reconstruct and find what actually occurred on board TWA 800, which 10 years ago exploded. Am I right? 10 years ago? 10 years ago
TWA Flight 800 was, I think, 97.
97, beg your pardon. 5 years ago.
The cockpit flight recorders and the black boxes were found in a remarkably short time, given that they were under the sea, and yielded very little useful information. In this case, I think you're going to hear a lot more dialogue. If you recall the crash of Egypt Air Flight 990, you know, the cockpit voice recorders were very telling as to what unfolded, or at least many people believe they were. So in this case, I think you'll probably see your first answers about what occurred on the aircraft in Pennsylvania. We do have an advantage here that people with cellular phones, other than Mrs. Olson, did call out to 911, to emergency numbers, because they were low over land, and started to report these things. And the National Security Agency, which records everything, a variety of signals in the air, is backtracking and looking for cellular signals that they have on tape to see if they can capture more of those calls, and they have.
Just to review New York City itself, because it's New York City at which we are currently looking. The mayor and the governor have just held a news conference. Most of the news forthcoming from the mayor, of course. He says it's difficult to move in the city. The city will be open tomorrow. There are 2,000 people in terms of walking wounded, and he's been very careful from the outset not to guess at casualties and suggest that there's a real urgency in the press corps and the news media to know about them. I don't think there is. I just think that people want to get some sense of the magnitude of this, and it's for families and friends around the country who want to know on a personal basis what's happened to their friends and their relatives. So he's not going to give his account. He's urged people in New York City tonight not to feel any hate and anger. He said that prejudice actually caused this. And he went on to say the United States government will find out what happened, but now it is up to the people of New York City to put the best face on, behave like New Yorkers. There was nothing that actually full. And Governor Pataki then said that, you know, they were seeking help from a lot of people, and we'll come back to that in a long time, but for many people around the country, it is time for world news.
This is an ABC News special report.
Hello again, everybody, and for those of you joining us now who I cannot imagine under any circumstances expected to see a normal World News Tonight broadcast at this time, we've been on the air for the last 10 hours as the country has endured or is trying to get through, as one official here in New York said, this horrendous attack on the United States today in both New York City and outside Washington at the Pentagon, and an attack that may or may not have gone wrong on Camp David in Maryland, the president's country retreat, but certainly resulted in the deaths of some people on yet another airliner today. So this is going to be a very different broadcast, and try to deal in the next half hour, as we have dealt with today, in a comprehensive way exactly what the United States has been through today. It began a little more than 10 hours, a little less than 10 hours ago, when first one aircraft, we'll take you through the video scenes of the day, when first one aircraft and then another hit and ultimately destroyed the twin trade towers, 110 stories high, on the west side of Manhattan. We didn't see the first one happen, even though television was on. And that is the astonishing second one, as seen by a freelance cameraman who joined us a short while ago. And he then stayed on to record this extraordinary, which we've seen from many angles, collapse of first one of the trade towers and then of the other. And the attack brought down these two towers upon themselves ultimately, and has left this extraordinary pile of rubble. Video brought to us from yet another person. Meanwhile, we have this crash at the Pentagon, 200 feet wide. Concern at the White House. Obviously, the president was in Florida early today, but then, particularly when word that a fourth plane had been hijacked, which ultimately crashed in the Pennsylvania countryside outside Johnstown, Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. The President of the United States has spent part of this day in an underground bunker in Nebraska. He's on his way back to Washington now. He's going to speak to the nation tonight. The Navy's Atlantic Fleet was at one point diverted to come and bring aircraft carriers to New York Harbor so that they could assist. There's help and assistance descending on New York and Washington from a variety of places. And it's probably not at all unfair to say that the entire country is, in some measure, in shock as to what has happened to the United States in a psychological, symbolic, and very physical way on this particular day. In this half hour, we're going to try to put together just some of the more cogent reporting of our reporters who've been watching this throughout the day. And I want to go first to ABC's Diane Sawyer, who's been in Midtown Manhattan all day, gathering what she can. Diane.
All right, Peter, forgive me if I don't respond to you carefully, because it's still very noisy down here, and I'm going to kind of tell you what happened to me. We're now about 4 blocks from the scene, and as you can see, even at this hour, it's like being on the edge of the crater of a volcano. The smoke is still pouring out, the air is still acrid with fumes. Everywhere around me, I see haggard firefighters, exhausted policemen. And then in this eerie disconnect in New York, occasionally you see people just succumbing to the everyday and walking by. But still, when you look at this, it is clear it is not over, because as we know, within the last hour, another building came down, number 47, a 47-story building. And also they're saying they're evacuating now the Millennium Hotel, so this may not be over in a number of ways. As I said, when you walk around the streets of New York, and it's too easy probably to say that it's like one of those techno future thrillers where everything seems wrong, and yet people are carrying packages. They've been shopping while firefighters are still streaking their way down here. I also want to bring in, if I can, Don Daler, Peter, because Don has been down here all day. He was with us this morning as well. And about an hour ago, you made your way up to the scene, and you've had those pictures from the private photographer, Peter. But I want Don to tell us what he saw when he went to the scene himself.
Right. Well, about an hour ago, we made our way down Broadway past where there were a large number of firemen gathered, very frustrated, very exhausted, because they were not being allowed to put out these fires in the number of the buildings around the site of the World Trade Center itself. There was too much danger for them to be going there. They wanted to go and work. We made our way past the firemen and got about half a block away from where this building on this side would have been standing. And there was billowing smoke. It was hard to see everything, but I clearly saw something worse than what Dante would have imagined. There was rubble, there was twisted metal, and I clearly saw bodies and what appeared to be body parts strewn on the street, on the rubble itself.
And people still working on the evacuations.
Working on evacuation, yes, but they were forcing, at the point I was there, the police were forcing everyone from emergency workers to the firemen away because there was such a fear, as you saw later, of a building collapse.
Well, I want to give you a sense again, Peter, of what it is like here when one of the buildings collapsed. We have here Jeff Rosen, who's from WABC, our affiliate, which has done great work today on this story. And Jeff, we have footage, and I hope we can cue it up, because we see this wall, this thunderous wall of smoke streaking down the street, and you were just ahead of it. And for all of you who were trying to escape it, what was that like?
Well, what happened was we saw this big cloud coming at us. It was dust and it was smoke, and we knew the people inside of it couldn't see anything because we saw them running at us. So our job was to just get out of the way. What happened was we couldn't get out of the way fast enough, and it caught up with us. We have people crying. They were creating a human chain, literally walking around like this because they couldn't see anything. At one point, we were stuck. We were at a store with a glass front, and we couldn't get in. There was no way to go. We couldn't breathe. We didn't have masks. So an officer, a police officer from New York, came in with an axe and literally just bashed in the window and led us into that store. If it wasn't for that, I'm not sure what we would have done, and that's been a huge problem all day. Couldn't just see anything, and that was the problem.
What was the heat like, and how suffocating was it for those trying to escape?
It was hot, but luckily we were a couple of blocks away, and the bigger problem was all the dust, and it got into your lungs, and you just kept coughing, and you couldn't speak, and you couldn't see. That, I mean, people were walking at the polls, people were crying and screaming. It was a nightmare. It was a nightmare.
Well, again, these are just a couple of people who've been on the scene all day, Peter. And as we said, we have watched this footage. We have seen people both heroic, terrified, and mystified. And the scene out here tonight is really just one of complete, almost wounded numbness. And there's no other phrase I can summon at this moment to convey it to you.
Thank you very much, Diane. Diane Sawyer, who's been in Midtown Manhattan all day trying to get a grasp of the city and very effectively what's going on around her. Don Dahler from ABC News Good Morning America has been down with a couple of freelance photographers. It's freelance photographers who brought us the most intimate, the closest up video of what actually happened at the Twin Trade Towers today. It's a reminder of the world we live in. There's a camera pointed by somebody almost everywhere. Catch you up very quickly on a story to say again what we said before World News Tonight came on, which that U.S. officials speaking for some reasons on the conditions of anonymity say the United States is not involved in any of the violence going on in Kabul, the Afghanistan capital tonight. This appears to be an intra-Afghan affair, that the supporters of a leading anti-Taliban leader who was killed the other day have been rocketing the city tonight, so it has nothing, as best we can tell, to do with this. And then, of course, there was the Pentagon, and it just, think back 10 hours, it just began to pile up on us, one thing after the other. One was horrible, the next was third horrible. By the time the Pentagon attacked, shortly after the attack on the Twin Trade Towers, it was amazing. And here's ABC's John McCarthy, who's been there all day. John?
Peter, it was at 9:38 this morning. I was innocently sitting in my office at the Pentagon when there was a jolting blast on the other side of the building. You can see it over my shoulder. A large aircraft came down 395, which is a major highway. It clipped off the tops of many of the light poles on the way in, and it slammed into the building. You can see on the one side of the huge gash that 25 windows down along the Pentagon were destroyed. The building, the section of the building that was hit by the fuselage of the aircraft collapsed several minutes after the aircraft hit it. I was able to get an exclusive walk up to the damaged site with some officials who got me through police lines. The area is surrounded with police evidence markings all over. There was a huge area for medical triage that is quiet now. and now they are continuing to fight fires inside the building, Peter, so they can go ahead and try and get anyone who may be still trapped in the rubble. It took them 5 hours before they were able to get into the building initially and begin to look for people who might be trapped and injured.
John, we heard a while ago, and there's some chaos here too, as you can understand, about a preliminary casualty figure at the Pentagon. Do you feel you have a good handle on that?
I do not have a good handle on it, Peter. There have been wild rumors from several hundred to over 1,000. It's impossible to know at this point, and I will not speculate.
And you may have said this most recently, and we would never want you to speculate, John. We believe, I believe you said now what you'd said earlier before, that the senior military officials at the Pentagon, none of them have been hurt to the best of your knowledge.
Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, is in just a few minutes going to hold a briefing inside the Pentagon for a very few number of reporters that are over there. And all of the military chiefs have been accounted for, and they have been spending the day in the National Military Command Center. Presumably, they have initially been looking at rescue options, but we also believe they are looking at retaliation options. But before that can happen, of course, the United States has to determine who they believe is responsible for this attack. I'll tell you, Peter, there is a pervasive sense of anger among the military officers I've talked to today. They have mentioned again and again Pearl Harbor, saying that it is going to be dwarfed. The number of people killed in Pearl Harbor so many years ago, just about 2,600. They say the casualties from this one are going to be so much worse. They are ready to go to war. There is a sense of war here at the Pentagon.
And thank you very much, John McWethy at the Pentagon. We'll be coming back to you many times in the course of the evening. The question is, go to war with whom? Because from the FBI, from the CIA, from the Pentagon today, no warning of this whatsoever, no knowledge of who's involved, no clues yet as to who's involved that we have heard about in any respect today. It has been interesting today to try to focus on the president, too, because the country does so clearly focus, I can't read that, I'm sorry, does focus on the president in a moment like this for leadership. And I believe that Ann Compton, who's been with the president all day, in a very tight group of people with the president, is on Air Force One and can talk to us at the moment. Annie, can you hear me?
Yes, Peter, I can. We're just getting off of Air Force One. He has arrived back in Washington with a dramatic flight with F-16s and F-15s on either wing as he came into Andrews Air Force Base. And the president feels it's important to address the nation tonight. Later this evening, he will give what we are told is a message of reassurance to Americans that the United States has been tested before and has always passed those tests. And when we saw him briefly toward the back of the plane, he was resolute.
Annie, thank you very much. The president will take a helicopter, I gather, from Andrews Air Force Base downtown, or do we know that?
Well, we do know that, but it's one of the things we aren't going to talk about until he's safely at home.
We just did, inadvertently, and as we had not been told not to talk about it, but there was some question. The president does traditionally come from Andrews Air Force Base down, and one assumes, given the extraordinary security that's surrounded the president today and how the Secret Service has moved him first from Florida and then out to Nebraska and now to Louisiana, first of all, then to Nebraska and back to Washington, president all over the country. Here's the Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, who's been in the Pentagon all day. And we're having difficulty hearing him, and one should not be surprised if there isn't some kind of, if there's some kind of hookup that didn't work today. Very, very rarely today have we had a problem. So we'll have our reporter on the scene listen to this, and the moment that we can hear him, we will go back to him. But in the meantime, Claire Shipman is just outside the White House across Lafayette Square. Claire, I want to check in quickly with you, if I may, to know that if we know anything about the president's plans for this evening that we, in some respects, haven't had on the air today, or go beyond what Ann's reporting is.
Well, what we do know is that we're told by sources who've been with the president today that he is extremely upset, of course, about what has happened, but agitated and angry. Somebody told us that the language he will use tonight will be retaliatory. He will express his impatience. In other words, he will say there won't be a long time spent thinking about how to act once
Claire,
the U.S. is confident.
I apologize. I wouldn't interrupt you if
Sure.
we couldn't go back to Mr. Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense. Well, the best laid plans. First of all, here we are.
Kind enough to come down and has been with us. We've very recently had a discussion with the President of the United States. Chairman Hugh Shelton has just landed from Europe. Secretary of the Army, Tom White, who has a responsibility for incidents like this as executive agent for the Department of Defense, is also joining me. It's an indication that the United States government is functioning in the face of this terrible act against our country. I should add that the briefing here is taking place in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's functioning. It'll be in business tomorrow. I know the interest in casualty figures, and all I can say is it's not possible to have solid casualty figures at this time. And the various components are doing roster checks, and we'll have information at some point in the future, and as quickly as it's possible to have it, it will certainly be made available to each of you. I'll be happy to take a few questions after asking First General Shelton if he would like to say anything, and then we will allow the others to make a remark or two.
General Shelton,
Thank you,
outgoing
Secretary.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the Secretary just said, today we have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people. Acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country. I extend my condolences to the entire Department of Defense families, military and civilian, and to the families of all those throughout our nation who lost loved ones. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragedy and the tragic dangers that we face day in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Mr. Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin.
Our intense focus on recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman preceding Carl Levin, I can assure you that the Congress stands behind our president, and the president speaks with one voice for this entire nation. This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history, and yet I think it can be its finest hour, as our president and those with him, most notably our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and the men and women of the armed forces all over this world stand ready not only to defend this nation and our allies against further attack, but to take such actions as are directed in the future in retaliation for this terrorist act. A series of terrorist acts unprecedented in world history. We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next? Step forward and let us hold accountable and punish those that have perpetrated this attack. Again, I commend the Secretary, the Chairman, and how proud we are. We spoke with our President here moments ago. He's got a firm grip on this situation, and the Secretary and the General have a firm grip on our armed forces and in communication of the world over.
The Secretary of Defense, Carl Levin, Senator, Democratic Senator Carl. They're going to take questions. Let's stay here with this and see if anything is revealed.
Mr. Secretary, did you have any inkling at all, in any way, that something of this nature and something of this scope might be planned?
Charlie, we don't discuss intelligence matters.
I see. And how would you respond if you find out who did this?
Obviously, the President of the United States has spoken on that subject, and those are issues that he will address in good time.
Mr.
Yes.
Secretary, we are getting reports from CNN and others that there are bombs exploding in Kabul, Afghanistan. Are we at the moment striking back, and if so, is the target Osama bin Laden and his organization?
I've seen those reports. In no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
Mr. Secretary, you said you could not be specific about casualties. Can you give us some characterization of whether it's dozens or hundreds in the building?
Well, we know there were large number, many dozens in the aircraft that flew at full power, steering directly into between, I think, the first and second floor of the opposite the helipad. You've seen it. There cannot be any survivors. It just would be beyond comprehension. There are a number of people that they've not identified by name, but identified as being dead, and there are a number of casualties. But the FBI has secured the site, and the information takes time to come. People have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
Sir, could you tell us what you saw?
Mr. Secretary, do you consider what happened today, both in New York and here, an act of war?
There is no question but that the attack against the United States of America today was a vicious, well-coordinated, a massive attack against the United States of America. What words the lawyers will use to characterize it is for them.
The Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, being asked all the obvious questions, and let's just quickly review them before we move. Did they have any inkling of this in advance? The answer is they don't discuss this. Every single piece of evidence we have seen all day says the United States in no way had any inkling of what was going to happen, and if they did, boy, somebody missed something somewhere. Secretary, reaffirming what we reported to you already, the U.S. has no, or saying again what we've said already, that the U.S. has no involvement in Afghanistan, the violence occurring in Kabul tonight. This is not a time to discuss whether or not the United States suspects Osama bin Laden, but he's been at the top of the list of American suspects for international acts of international terrorism for so long now, it's impossible not to imagine he wouldn't be at the top. Casualties in the building, he says there are many, and then he goes on to make the point that we sometimes forget in covering New York and the Pentagon today, and that is the people who died on the aircraft. 266 people died on 3 aircraft today, 4 aircraft today. The 2 that crashed into the trade towers, the 1 that crashed into the Pentagon, and the 1 that crashed in Pennsylvania today, whether or not it was on a mission or not. Was this an act of war? Secretary of Defense and everybody else in the government today, you can expect to be very careful about using the phrase an act of war, because it imposes on the United States certain requirements to respond in certain ways if they find themselves involved in a war, especially with another country. We believe this is now the President coming from Andrews Air Force Base to the White House, but it was Senator John Warner, one of the most senior politicians involved with the military for many, many years now, and a man with a real sense of history and knowledge of history, surely, who describes this as the most tragic hour in America's history. I think there will be people, not least of whom are historians throughout the country, will argue with the senator about that today, given the attack on Pearl Harbor, given the invasion of Normandy, and heavens knows, given the first and most tragic days of the Civil War in 1861, who will argue with that characterization. But it does give you some real sense at the moment of how intense the feeling is, not only in the political establishment in the country as a whole as well, and all sorts of other countries. I'm getting messages from countries all day today, people deeply, profoundly shaken by the experience that the United States has had today. I want to go to Washington now because Claire Shipman is there right opposite the White House. We'll come back to Charlie Gibson and casualties in just a moment. But as we think, Claire, that the president may indeed be arriving, are those helicopters, Air Force or Marine One as it's called, the president's helicopter coming from Andrews Air Force Base?
Yes, that's right, Peter. And in fact, we're told the only reason that his security team felt comfortable letting him chopper back to the White House was because there is substantial air cover in the area keeping him protected. But it has been a long day for him, as you noted, and he has, we're told from people who were with him, wanted to get back to the White House all day, but again was listening very closely to his security team, who wanted to be absolutely certain that that was going to be all right. We were talking earlier, the president is very eager to make plain tonight that his mood is retaliatory, to express impatience. We got a little bit of a hint of that from a statement from Ari Fleischer, his press secretary today, who said not so long ago, we will find these people and they will suffer the consequences of taking on this nation. I wouldn't be surprised to hear something like that from the president tonight. Equally eager to get back, Peter, just as the president is back, congressional leaders, they're planning to make a public statement tonight at 7:30 p.m. Again, everybody wanting to show this is business as usual in Washington, certainly not usual in the way we would ever define it, but they want to show a government that is up and functioning because they think that the PR element here, in terms of sending a message around the world, is every bit as important as security measures.
As we wait, I'm going to just bring in the voice of Charlie Gibson at the moment because I do not want to go away from this scene on what I assume is the south lawn of the White House. We'll just stay with this and watch the president come out. But Charlie, you've been trying to get some kind of handle on casualties throughout the day. Have had any success?
Well, no, Peter. People want a number. And as if it were some way to quantify these most horrific of acts. And properly, no one has been willing to speculate on what that number may be. Obviously, any low number would have to be ratcheted up at some point, and to give upper-end estimates are probably too horrible to imagine. As the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, said, when we get the final number,